church. It's great to see you here this morning, and good morning to everyone who is joining us online. I want to tell you a story, and this is a story of when we were in our very first COVID lockdown. And in this season in my life, I found that I was going on a lot of prayer walks because God was doing a work in my heart. He was actually doing a work on my iceberg. He was not focusing on the 10% that we see, but he was going deeper into the 90% that is below the surface. And this one particular prayer walk, I was walking, and it was like I saw this picture, and I was sort of walking in this direction, and this picture came onto to the right of me. And it was this picture of a tip, right? A place full of rubbish. And it was sort of surrounded by fences, but there was this gate that you could go in. And as you approached this gate, I was overwhelmed by this smell, like this rotting, dirty, disgusting smell. And I'm not sure about you, but I find that smells is one of the senses that is the hardest to overcome. Right? If I can see something that looks disgusting, I still probably won't want to look at it. But if I smell something that is disgusting, I want to throw up, I want to run away. I find it really difficult to handle. And so as you know, there was this tip and this gate, and as I was sort of drawn into this space, this smell came and it hit me. And I felt like God say to me, is that Rachel, I want you to go and find where that smell is coming from. Because it is hiding underneath a pile of rubbish, right? And in that darkness, it is festering. Right? You can just imagine whatever this is, if it's a bit of food that's gone rotten, because it's in the darkness, it's staying moist, it's staying wet, and the smell is just festering. It's not going anywhere. And it's causing me to want to run away because it's so gross. Right? But God said, you know what? I want you to go looking for that smell. I want you to figure out what is causing it, and then I want you to bring it out into the light. Right? I want you to bring it out into the light because he said to me that once you bring that out into the light, it will slowly start to fade. Right? It wasn't going to go straight away, but he said it was going to fade. And I guess a promise that I didn't realize at the time, and I'm probably only noticing right now, the promise that he was saying to me is that, Rachel, you won't be so afraid to go back. You won't be so afraid to go into your own personal tip, right? I don't know about you, but I have a personal tip, right, where all my rubbish, all my junk, it goes, right? And that's okay. We're human, right? The Bible tells us that all of us will have that. But what God was almost saying to me is, Rachel, I don't want you to be afraid of it anymore. I don't want you to run from it anymore. And so there was an invitation. There was this invitation from God, for me, saying, let's go find this together. And let's pull out whatever is causing that, and let's bring it into the light so it doesn't have so much power in your life anymore. You see, the topic that we are talking about today is about going back in order to go forward, right? Going back in order so that we can go forward. And we're continuing our series called Emotionally Healthy Spirituality. And there is a book that goes along with this series. And if you've got the copy, great. I hope that you're enjoying reading that. And if you don't have a copy and you want to get a copy, come and speak to me after the service and I can point you in the right direction. But this series is all about how God is wanting to transform our lives. Right? And at the start of the series, Ryan talked to us about that picture of an iceberg, about how we can see the top 10% of an iceberg is outside of the water, that everyone can see. But there's 90% of that iceberg underneath the water. And this series is all about that 90% that is underneath, that is not seen. And it's about going, well, how do we go on this journey with God to transform our whole selves? And you know, the purpose of that, the purpose of going on that journey is so that we can actually become more like Jesus. So that we can go out and represent God well. So that we can bring out the God colors in our lives and in the world around us. And we can step into the plan that God has for us. And so the chapter that we're looking at is chapter 3. And like I said before, it's titled Going Back in Order to Go Forward. And the book uses the story of Joseph from the Bible. And in this story, the book draws out some principles that we can learn from Joseph about how do we do this? How do we go back so that we can move forward? And if you have your Bibles with you, you'll be able to find the story of Joseph in the very first book of the Bible. It's called Genesis. All right, it's got 50 chapters, and the end of Joseph's story is in that 50th chapter. And we are going to look at the end of that story today. But the story of Joseph is actually quite long, okay? It's over about 7 or 8 chapters. And so obviously I don't want to sit here and read 7 or 8 chapters together. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to give you an overview of the story. I used to be a kids pastor, so I feel like I'm an expert in telling the Joseph story, right? We've told it very many times. But what we're going to do then is we're going to just dig in deep to the end part of that passage, all right? So let's start with the story of Joseph. So Joseph was a boy, all right, and he lived in a family. Now, if we took Joseph's direct family, right, his full-blood relatives, he would come from a very normal family. He had a mum and a dad and him and another brother. Okay, so his dad's name was Jacob, his mum's name was Rachel, he was Joseph the elder brother, and Benjamin was his younger brother. But up on the screen, you can see something very different to that. And that's because if we actually look at Joseph's whole family, we'll see a very complicated family, okay? So we've got Jacob, who had 2 wives and 2 concubines, all right? So his 2 wives were Leah and Rachel, and obviously Rachel was his favorite wife, all right? I can't blame him. There must be something that runs in the name. If you don't know, my name is Rachel. And so Jacob had 2 wives, 2 concubines. Rachel was his favorite wife. And between these 4 women, he had 12 sons. He also had 1 daughter, but we don't hear about the daughter. But in these 12 sons, Joseph is actually the 11th in line, okay? So he's got 10 older brothers, and then we've got Joseph number 11 and Benjamin number 12. And you see, Joseph, the reason why I've got him in a rainbow-coloured coat there is because Joseph was Jacob's favourite child. For those of you that have children, I don't know if you have a favourite. I've got one sitting upstairs with me today, so Jonah's my favourite child. No, just joking. I don't have a favourite child. But interestingly enough, Jacob did have a favourite child. And his favourite child was Joseph. And to show him that he was his favourite, to make it so obvious, he gave him a rainbow-coloured coat. Okay? And so because of this, Joseph's older brothers didn't like him, which you sort of don't blame them, right? Okay? So his older brothers didn't like him. And then to make it even worse, Joseph got a dream from God where God told him that his 11 brothers, older brothers, were going to go bow down and worship him. All right? So once again, this didn't make the brothers happy. They thought, we're not going to bow down and worship our younger brother. And so they went from not liking him to really not liking him, okay? Now, I know we all probably at one point or not have said that we don't like our siblings, right? I have 3 sisters. There were days where I did not like my siblings. But they didn't like him so much to the point that they were prepared to kill him. Okay? So they actually make a plan to kill him. But then they don't. But no, it wasn't because they loved him and they thought, oh, maybe I shouldn't kill him. They thought, no, let's make some money out of this. And so instead of killing him, they actually sold him into slavery. All right? And what they did is they took this rainbow coat that his father had given him and they covered it in animal's blood, and they went back and told Jacob that Joseph had been killed by wild animals. But meanwhile, Joseph was actually sold into slavery to the Egyptians. And so Joseph heads down to Egypt and he becomes a slave to a man named Potiphar. And so Joseph was actually quite good at his job and he was quite successful. It talks about how the Lord was with Joseph. And so Joseph was sort of got higher up in the ranks and he became in charge of Potiphar's household. And so this was, things were looking a little bit up for Joseph. He's gone from really bad, things started to look a little bit up. And so he was having a good time. But then what happened is Potiphar's wife decided that she fancied Joseph, thought he was a good-looking lad. The Bible tells us that he was good-looking. And so she thought, I wouldn't mind, getting with him, all right? But Joseph was a man of God, and Joseph said, no, I'm not going to dishonor Potiphar like that. And so after the rejection, Potiphar's wife actually turns the tables and then accuses Joseph of actually trying to sleep with him, all right? And then when Potiphar comes home, who do you think he believes, Joseph or his wife? He believes his wife. And so Joseph gets thrown into prison for something that he did not even do. And so that we don't know the exact amount of years, but Joseph was in jail for around 10 to 15 years. 10 to 15 years for something that he didn't even do. So we see Joseph start off with, being pretty good, being the favorite child, being sold into slavery. That's probably a low point. Then it went a bit back up. He became, the favorite slave. But then we see his life drop back down again, and he gets sent to jail and spends 10 to 15 years of his life in prison. Now, eventually, Joseph gets out of prison. God helps him by helping him explain dreams. And in particular, he was able to explain Pharaoh's dream. And so when this happened, Joseph was able to get out of jail. And things started to look a lot better because Joseph got put in charge of Egypt. So he was the second most powerful person in Egypt, right? So we can see that things have gone from bad to good to bad. But right now, Joseph is in a pretty good spot. And because of the way that Joseph interpreted this dream, Joseph was actually able to save the nation of Egypt and the nations surrounding them from a great famine. And so in this time when things are going well for Joseph, when he's saving this nation from this great famine, other nations were actually coming to Egypt to get help, coming to get more food because there was nothing left for them. And what happened actually is Joseph's very own brothers made the journey to Egypt to ask for help. But little did they know that the person that they were asking for help from was their brother that they had sold into slavery. And so when the brothers approached, they didn't recognize Joseph, but Joseph recognized them. And you could just imagine in this moment when his brothers are coming for him to help, he had this decision to make. Am I going to live in the past? Am I going to live in the unforgiveness, in the bitterness, in the sadness? Or am I going to choose to move forward? Am I going to choose to move forward with forgiveness, in freedom and in love and in grace and in mercy? And for those of us that know the story, we know that this is Joseph's choice, that he chooses to move forward. And so what I want to do with you today is I want us to look at this chapter 50. It's chapter 50, verses 14 to 21. And I want us to look at, how does Joseph do this? Because that's a pretty big thing to move forward from. And so let's go back with Joseph and let's have a look about what did he do? How did he handle this so that maybe we can learn a little bit about how we can move forward. All right, so we're going to start reading at verse 14. It's on the screen, or you might have your Bible with you. And this is what it says. It says, after burying his father, Joseph returned to Egypt, together with his brothers and all the others who had gone with him to bury his father. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, what if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him? So what's happening here, right, is that Joseph has already forgiven his brothers and helped his brothers, right? Back when they first came to him to get some help, Joseph helped his family. He gave them all the food that he needed. He actually moved all of his his siblings, wives and children, and his mum and his dad, he moved them all down to Egypt and gave them the best land. And so for so many years, his brothers have been living with Joseph, and Joseph has been blessing them and taking care of them. But when Jacob died, the brothers had this fear, right, that Joseph was only doing what he was doing because of Jacob. Right? They didn't realize that Joseph was actually honoring God, not honoring Jacob. So when Jacob died, they had this fear of, will Joseph's forgiveness run out? Will he turn on us? And so this is what they did. So they sent word to Joseph saying, your father left these instructions before he died. This is what you are to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of the servants of the God of your father. right? So they made up this plan, right? This lie that actually said that their father left a message. But this didn't happen, right? And when Joseph heard this, he knew that it wasn't the truth. And his response is that when their message came to him, Joseph wept, right? Joseph wept. And with this word wept, what it means is that Joseph was emotional, that he was sensitive, right? That these actions from his brothers actually penetrated into the depths of his heart. Right? This isn't a story about the top 10% that everyone sees. Right? Joseph was a man who knew how to go deep with God. And this hurt that he was feeling with his brothers went deep. Right? And so this is how Joseph responded. Right? So actually, I will read on from verse 18. His brothers then came and threw themselves down before him, saying, "We are your slaves," they said. But this is how Joseph responded. He said, "Do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God?" Right? Do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God? And so Joseph's response to his brothers was, you know what? I don't hold the place for justice. Right? This is not my decision to bring justice to you. Joseph is saying that it is God who will take care of justice. And so Joseph is actually trusting in God and letting him work out the justice part. So he didn't have to get revenge. He didn't have to get even. He didn't need to teach his brothers a lesson. He was able to forgive his brothers and move forward because he let God do the justice part. And all he had to do was trust God. And the next verses tell us just exactly how much he trusted God. Verse 20 is probably the most important verse in what we're reading today. And some commentaries actually even say that this verse sums up the whole book of Genesis and what it's about. And this is what it says. It says, "You intended to harm me," speaking to his brothers. "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is being done, the saving of many lives. So then don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children." And he reassured them and spoke to them kindly. So what Joseph here is saying is, right, what you intended for harm, God used for good. You know, quite often in the world when bad comes to us, we think, is God trying to teach us a lesson? Did God intend the harm? But here in Joseph's situation, we're seeing that actually the brothers intended the harm, but God intended the good. And so when you're going through a difficult time in your life, don't jump straight away to thinking, God sent this trouble to me, right? Because it wasn't God who sent the trouble to Joseph. His brothers intended the harm, but what God actually does is when the world harms us, he brings good. And you see, this is the story not only of Joseph, but it's also the story of Jesus. You see, the world brought harm to Jesus, right? He was whipped, he was scorned, he was betrayed. You see, the world harmed Jesus, but God then intended it for good. And he just didn't intend it for good of the one. Because when God brought good into Joseph's and Jesus's life, he wasn't just helping them, but he was helping the many. Right, for Joseph, he saved Egypt and all the surrounding nations from the famine. And when Jesus was harmed, not only did God bring Jesus back to life, but he also brought the whole world back to life. And so as we wrap up what we're talking about today, if there is one thing that you could remember, one thing that we could learn from the story of Joseph as he went back in order to go forward, it is this, that when we invite God into our story, we will find purpose in the pain. Right? When we invite God into our story, we will find purpose in the pain. And when we look at the story of Joseph, we can see how this happened. That God took Joseph's pain and he turned it into purpose. And that same invitation is there for us. It's the same invitation that God gave to me when he gave me that picture of that tip, right? And it's the same invitation that he has for each and every one of you, right? If you go backwards, if you go back into your own story, that God will actually help you to find purpose in your pain. And I want to give you some homework if that's all right. Is that okay? Yeah? All right. So Rosemary and Simeon have a handout they're going to hand out to you, and we can email this out as well for those who are watching online. All right, and my homework for you this week, right? You might need to carve out, you could probably give half an hour to this task, or you could probably give about 4 hours to this task. It's up to you. But what I would love for you to do, what I invite you to do, is to actually take some time to journal your own story. Right, to journal your own story. And so the handout has on the front page a little bit of tips of how you look at your story. Okay, it talks about the external story, the internal story, and the spiritual story. And on the back page is some space. And you might think, well, I'm not going to be able to fit my story on that page. All right, but it's just some space to invite. And if you need to take more pages, do more pages. But I would hope that you might be able to take some time this week to jot down some points, to jot down some sentences of what has gone on in your life. But what I want to give you today is that as you potentially go on this journey, I want to talk to you about a couple of things. So the first thing is I want to give you a bit of a disclaimer that this might be hard, okay? All right, I want to pre-warn you that this might not be fun, okay? And so there's a few things that go with that. I want to remind you of a part of Joseph's story, a part that you could quite easily skip over, right? Joseph spent 10 to 15 years in prison, right? Joseph spent 10 to 15 years in prison. And I wonder if Joseph didn't have that time of solitude, that time of emptiness, that time of probably not really doing that much. I wonder if he didn't have that time, would he have got to the same place that he got to? Would he have got to that space of forgiveness and moving forward? You know, I personally think that he probably wouldn't have. Because it's sometimes in that time when our life feels like it's stopped, is when God can actually do a great work in us. So as you go through this process, don't be surprised if God slows you down. And I told you the story about, actually, no, I'm not going there. I actually want to go back a few years back, probably about 6 years back when I went on this journey. Because, you know, God keeps taking you on this journey. I'm sure for most of those who are older than me as well, you've probably gone on it many, many times. But probably the first time God really took me on this journey, I had 2 young children and I was working and I was studying and I didn't really have much time in the day. And so this space, it wasn't really a prison, but it was this space that was my own and it was lonely and there was nothing that was getting done, actually came during the night. And so I spent these nights where I would just wake up and I would be crying. I would be crying tears and I would be crying out to God because of the pain that I was processing. But you see, I feel like God works in our lives in this space when we actually make room for him. And for Joseph, I think that was his prison season, right? That he had this time to open his heart to God. And so don't be surprised that in this time, if God slows you down, or maybe you might intentionally need to slow down so that you can unpack some things with God. The other thing that I want to talk to you about is I've got a slide for this, and I've sort of skipped through a bit. So if we can go to the slide that talks about formative slavery, prison, and freedom. So you see in Joseph's part of his life, it sort of can be broken into 3 stages, right? He had those formative years where he was the favorite son and his brothers betrayed him, and that did a little bit of damage. And then he went into this season of slavery and prison. And it's in that time where I think God did a lot of work. And so then he was able to go into that space of freedom. And so don't be surprised that you might see this pattern occur in your life, that as you unpack those formative years, right, that you might go into this prison time, this slavery time, this time where things aren't looking all that great. But hold to Joseph's story, hold to the story of the cross, that there's this season of freedom after this season of pain. And the other one bit of advice that I have for as you unpack your story is use a little bit of discernment in this time. And so as you're writing your story, if you find that something is coming up that is really sort of, you're thinking, I don't think I can go there just yet, that's okay. My encouragement would be is to just put a little bit of an asterisk, right? And say, you know what, God, this part of my journey is a bit big for me at the moment. I don't know if I can go there. And just sit there with God. Maybe he might lead you into that space. But he also might say, you know what, I completely understand that. Let's just put an asterisk there and let's come back to that in the future. You know, psychologists talk about this term they call the window of tolerance. Okay, and what happens is the window of tolerance is this space that you can actually unpack something and not be re-traumatized from it. Okay, so if you're not inside your window of tolerance, if you start dredging up things from your past, you might find that it might bring more trauma, okay, than more freedom. And so use discernment that as you go back and as you unpack your story, if you feel like, you know what, I just can't go there, then don't. I sort of said to you before that about, 6 or 7 years ago, God took me on a journey and he did a whole lot of work. And I had this big break where things were going well and things were going wonderful, right? And then I had this moment during our first COVID lockdown where God took me backwards again, right? And I had this picture. He told me, he warned me. He said, look, Rachel, you've gone back to here, but I actually want to go back to here now with you. Okay? And so if you can't go and unpack everything in this season, that's okay. God will take you there when he is ready and when you are ready. And so I hope that you'll take some time this week or this month or this year to journal your story and let God start working on those parts of pain so that he can actually bring some purpose out of that space. Right? And my encouragement to give you, to have the courage to go to that space, right, is to remind you of the faithfulness of our God. Right, to remind you of the faithfulness of our God. You know, when God invited me into that space of pain, he didn't leave me there. He didn't leave me there. Right, I might have been in pain for a while. You know, I feel like when I go back with God, it probably takes about 12 months to get through it. But God doesn't leave you in pain. He takes your pain and he turns it into purpose. We saw this happen with Joseph, right? God took Joseph's pain and he turned it into a purpose, not just to save Joseph, but to save the many. And we see God do this in Jesus' life. God took Jesus to the cross. He took him to this place of pain and suffering. And he stayed in the tomb for 3 days. But he didn't leave him there. He took his pain and he turned it into purpose. Not just for Jesus and for his life, but actually for the world. And my encouragement for you today is that God can take your pain and he will turn it into purpose. And it won't just be purpose for you, but it will be purpose for many. There are people who will be in your world that need to hear your story. They'll need to hear how God has worked in your life. And so as you go back to move forward, I pray that you will have the courage to do that for yourself and for also those people who are in the world around you. And so let's just spend some time in prayer now and ask God to be with us in this journey. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you so much. We thank you so much for your promise that you will take our pain and that you will turn it into purpose. And dear Lord, I just want to pray for our church family right now. Lord, I want to pray that you give each and every one of us that courage. For that when you come knocking and you give us that invitation to go backwards, that you will help us to go there, knowing, as Matt said to us last week, that you are there with us in the mud, in the turmoil, walking alongside us. That we can look to you, that we can learn from you, that we don't have to feel alone. And so, Lord, I thank you so much for that you are not a God who rules from far away, but that you are a God who is so very near. And so, Lord, be with us as we journey through this as individuals and as a church. Go before us, Lord, and be with us and give us the courage that we need. And we thank you in advance for the purpose that you will bring to our life, that the freedom that you will bring for our lives, that the many that we will be able to help because of the work that you are doing in our hearts. So we just ask that you use this space. In Jesus' name, amen.